everyone. Question of plant consciousness. What is a plant? You likely have an idea. You might be picturing a fat sunflower with its hubcap face and thick belted stalk, or the bean vine looped around a trellis in your grandmother's yard. Maybe, like me, you're eyeing the golden pathos hanging in your kitchen window that you should probably water. A known entity, the green of every single day. Of course, you're right. In the same way humans have been able to point to an octopus for all of history and call it an octopus. But we didn't know until recently that octopuses could taste with their arms, use tools, remember human faces, see their world far more sensitively than we can ours, that they have neurons distributed throughout their bodies like a multitude of disparate miniature brains. So then, what is an octopus? Something much more than we ever imagined. The answer is only beginning to dawn on us, and has already revolutionized our understanding of non-human intelligence in one crucial aspect. The octopus's branch on the evolutionary tree diverged from ours very early in the history of animal life. Our last common ancestor was likely a flatworm that trailed the ocean floor more than 500 million years ago. For comparison, the last common ancestor of humans and dolphins was a land-dwelling mammal who lived something like 50 million years ago. Our last common ancestor with chimpanzees lived just 6 million years ago. Up until this point, we've located intelligence in animals much evolutionarily closer to ours, like dolphins, dogs, and primates, our much more recent cousins. But we now know that powerful cunning can evolve completely independently from our own. A similar tectonic shift is happening with plants, only, for now, more quietly in the labs and field sites of one of the least flashy disciplines within the life sciences. But the weight of this new knowledge is threatening to burst the walls of the container in which we place plants in our minds. Ultimately, it may change how we think about life altogether. So what is a plant? I certainly thought I knew, and then I began to talk to botanists. Several years ago, I was an environmental reporter with a problem. Most of my work focused on two things: the steady advance of climate change and the health effects of polluted air and water. In other words, I was writing about humanity's unrelenting death plot. After 5 or 6 years on that beat, a crawling sense of dread threatened to eclipse me. In response, I began to act strangely. I'd explained the latest IPCC report, the one telling us we had very few years to stave off catastrophe, to my colleagues with an eerie sort of glee, awaiting their paled faces. I'd often spend a morning ingesting news about record-breaking wildfires and hurricanes, and pivot seamlessly to office gossip by lunch. The compartmentalization fuck that up, I think, became so total that I could no longer muster any emotional response to environmental cataclysm. Melting ice sheets in Greenland started to look like just another good story. It was around then that I began to search, without realizing it, for something in the natural sciences that felt wonderful and alive. I liked plants. I loved watching my night-blooming jasmine clamber up my window frame and my fiddle-leaf fig burst open 3 new leaves in a sudden growth spurt after months of no visible change. My apartment was a refuge of satisfying plant drama, better than the drama unspooling inside my computer. So, I thought, why not turn my reporter brain toward them? I began searching botany journals on my lunch break, using the same online portals I use to find climate papers, a system that lets journalists see the latest research before it is available to the public on the condition that they not publish stories about it until its stipulated release date. The journals were full of fundamental discoveries about plants, uncovering the evolutionary origins of bananas and understanding, at last, why some flowers are slippery to deter nectar-thieving ants. I felt like I was spying on a version of science from an earlier time. Were there really this many fundamentals left to be uncovered? 2 weeks into my new fascination, I learned that a complete fern genome had been sequenced for the first time, and a paper on it would be coming out soon. I didn't yet know how remarkable that was. Ferns, being extremely ancient, can have up to 720 pairs of chromosomes versus humans' mere 23, which explains why the genomic revolution took so much time to reach them. I was immediately taken by the image of the fern that accompanied the embargoed scientific paper. It was a photograph of the tiny scalloped plant atop the researcher's thumbnail, an azolla. It was so green it looked lit from within. I was in love. Azolla filiculoides, or just azolla for short. I'm going to spell it out. It's AZOLLAFILICULOIDES. Just azolla is one of the world's smallest ferns and has grown in wet places for millennia. As is generally the rule of plants, it is unwise to mistake size for complexity. Roughly 50 million years ago, when the Earth was a much warmer place, azolla began growing over the Arctic Ocean in vast fern blankets. Over the next million years, they absorbed so much CO2 that paleobotanists believed they played a crucial role in cooling the planet, and some researchers are looking into whether they could do that again. The azolla performs another miraculous trick still. Some 100 million years ago, it evolved a specialized pocket in its body to house a packet of cyanobacterium that fixes nitrogen. The air around us is nearly 80% nitrogen, and every life form, including ours, needs it to manufacture nucleic acids, the building blocks of all life. But in its atmospheric form, it is entirely out of our reach. Nitrogen everywhere, and not a single molecule we can use. In a humbling twist, plants rely wholly upon bacteria that know how to recombine nitrogen into forms the plant and all of us who get our nitrogen from plants can use. And so azolla morphed itself into a hotel for this bacteria. The tiny fern feeds the cyanobacterium the sugars it needs, and the cyanobacteria busy themselves with transforming nitrogen. Farmers in China and Vietnam took note of this and have been grinding azolla into their rice paddies for centuries. I sought out fern guidebooks and fern lore. I was charmed by my own rapaciousness, which had been activated like this only a few times in my life. I was so enamored that I got the tiny azolla tattooed on my left arm. Journalists are notorious generalists, interested briefly and drenchingly in many things they soon leave behind. But this was, I thought, what it must be like to be taken with something. I had questions suddenly about this commonest group of plants that had sprouted seemingly without fanfare. They changed the world. What else did I not know? As part of this inquiry, I bought and devoured Osaka Journal, OAZXACA Journal, a slender volume of Oliver Sacks' observations from a flying expedition to southwestern Mexico and took with a bus full of dedicated amateur God. Pteridologist. It's Pteridollogists. I'm gonna look that up later. Google it. Yeah. All of them from New York chapter of the American Fern Society. The expedition was co-led by Robin C. Moran, a 44-year-old curator of ferns at the New York Botanical Garden, who brought them all around the state of, Osaka? Am I saying that right? I don't know if I am. I apologize if not. At one point, after days of visiting villages and landscapes, marveling at produce in the markets and dye vats of red something, Cocchineal. Cocchineal? I don't know. My anxiety is high. I'm gonna keep going. I can do this. Yeah. Where was I? I lost my spot. Here we are. And of course, all manner of liverworts and ferns, sex has a moment that can only be described as rapture. The afternoon sun is falling strong and slant against high stalks of corn. An older gentleman, a botanist and specialist on Osakan agriculture, is standing beside the corn. Sex acknowledges the numerous moment, the briefest flicker, with barely half a sentence, but it stung me immediately as true. The tall corn, the strong sun, the old man became one. This is one of those moments, indescribable, when there is a sense of intense reality and an almost preternatural reality, and then we are descending the trail to the gate, reboarding the bus, all in a sort of trance or daze, as if we had had a sudden vision of the sacred, but were now back in the secular, everyday world. The experience of flashes of the eternal, the real, the gestalt, runs like a thread throughout naturalist literature. I wasn't the only one who had been taken like this before. In Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the writer Annie Dillard had a similar moment in front of a tree, watching light pour through its branches. A flash of the real. Almost as soon as she realizes she is having it, it is gone, but it leaves her with the awareness of a sort of open plan, attentiveness that can be accessed in snippets, and which might be a more direct observation of the world than the usual everyday version. As I read more books about plants and their enraptured naturalists after work and into the early morning, I began to find these moments sprinkled everywhere. In The Invention of Nature, Andrea Wolf's biography of the famous 19th century naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, I learned he'd had it too. Von Humboldt wondered aloud why being in the outdoors evoked something existential and true. Nature everywhere speaks to man in a voice that is familiar to his soul, he wrote. Everything is interaction and reciprocal, and therefore nature gives the impression of the whole. Humboldt went on to introduce the European intellectual world to the concept of the planet as a living whole, with climatic systems and interlocking biological and geological patterns bound up as a net-like intricate fabric. This was Western science's earliest glimmer of ecological thinking, where the natural world became a series of biotic communities, each acting upon the others. Something about reading botany papers gave me snatches of that feeling, glimpses of a sort of whole I couldn't yet fully articulate. I had the sense I was uncovering large gulfs in my knowledge. How long could I spend in the presence of plants while knowing next to nothing about them? I felt a curtain drawing back little by little into I felt curtain drawing back, little by little, onto a parallel universe. I knew it was there now, but not yet what it held. I signed up for a fern science class at the New York Botanical Garden, taught by none other than the Moran from Sachs's expedition, no longer 44, but youthful just the same. I would come to learn that the botany world comprises a cast of recurring characters with storylines between them, some amiable, some not. We learned how to identify ferns, about their basic structure, and about the more idiosyncratic species. A resurrection fern grows on the branches of oak trees and can almost completely dehydrate in times of drought, shrinking down into a dead-looking crisp. It can remain in its dried state for more than 100 years and still fully rehydrate. Tree ferns can grow more than 65 feet high, and other ferns are minuscule fertilizer factories like the tiny azolla. And then there's the bracken fern, which makes cows who dare to graze it bleed internally to death. Just a totally cool fern, Moran said. I learned that ferns are much, much older evolutionary than flowering plants. They appeared on the scene even before evolution drained the concept of seeds. They reproduced without them. Days later, during lunch hours spent reading about ferns, falling desperately into true obsession, I learned that this lack of seeds boggled Europeans for centuries. All plants had seeds. It was key to their sexual reproduction, or so medieval people thought. If they couldn't find the fern seeds, contemporary logic followed that they simply must be invisible. And because another dominant theory at the time suggested that the physical characteristics of plants were clues about what they could be used for, people believed finding these invisible seeds would grant humans the power of invisibility. Actual fern sex turned out to be much weirder. First of all, they reproduce using spores, not seeds. But here's the kicker. They have swimming sperm. This is so fascinating. Oh my god. Before they grow into the leafy fronds we all know, they have a completely separate life as a gametophyte fern, a tiny lobed plant just 1 cell thick, not remotely recognizable as the fern it will later become. You'd miss them on the forest floor. The male gametophyte fern releases a sperm that swim in water collected on the ground after a rain, looking for female gametophyte fern eggs to fertilize. Fern sperm are shaped like tiny corkscrews in our endurance athletes. They can swim for up to 60 minutes. You can watch them squiggle under a microscope. The sperm alone isn't the most amazing thing about fern reproduction. In 2018, at the beginning of my infatuation, research was emerging to suggest that ferns compete with other ferns for resources by emitting a hormone that causes the sperm of neighboring fern species to slow down. Slower sperm means less of that species survives, so the sabotaging fern can enjoy more of whatever is scarce, be it water, sunlight, or soil. Scientists were just beginning to wrap their heads around this fact. This is brand new. Eric Schupelz, Schuettpelz, a research botanist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., told me over the phone. Sabotaging sperm was evidently the cutting edge of fern science. We know it's the plant hormone, but have no idea how it works, he said. How did a fern know it was beside some fern competition? How did it time its malevolent release? A fern researcher at Colgate University had just presented an early paper on the phenomenon at a botany conference that same month. I let that sink in a minute. ferns can remotely interfere with other ferns' sperm. That was incredibly salty plant activity. I began to see where Morin was coming from. This also seemed remarkably brilliant. What else could plants do? With that question in mind, I began to focus my newfound lens on a relatively young area within plant science, plant behavior. The announcements of emerging research, I found, were peppered with plant behavior papers. This represented a new mental gate for me to walk through. The plants that could be taught to behave at all was still an enchanting possibility. But several papers I found pushed the farthest edge of that concept farther. They suggested that the plants might have a form of intelligence. I was intrigued and skeptical. I wasn't the only one. As it turned out, the suggestion of plant intelligence had recently started an all-out war. I'd come across this corner of the scientific world at a remarkably exciting time. In the last decade and a half, a revival of plant behavior research had brought countless new realizations to botany. More than 40 years after an irresponsible selling book nearly snuffed out the field for good. The Secret Life of Plants, published in 1973, captured the public imagination on a global scale. Written by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, the book was a mix of real science, flimsy experiments, and unscientific projection. In one chapter, Tompkins and Bird suggested that plants could feel and hear, and that they preferred Beethoven to rock and roll. In another, a former CIA agent named Cleve Baxter hooked up a polygraph test to his houseplant and imagined the plant being set on fire. The polygraph needle went wild, which would mean the plant was experiencing a surge in electrical activity. And humans a reading like that was believed to denote a surge of stress. The plant, according to Baxter, was responding to his malevolent thoughts. The implication was that there existed not only a sort of plant consciousness, but also plant mind reading. The book was an immediate and success on the popular market, surprising for a book about plant science. Paramount put out a feature film about it. Stevie Wonder wrote the soundtrack. The first pressings of the album version were sent out scented with floral perfume. To its many astonished readers, the book offered a new way to view the plants around them, which up until then had seemed ornamental, passive, more akin to the world of rocks than animals. It also aligned with the advent of New Age culture, which was ready to inhale stories about how plants were as alive as we are. People began talking to their houseplants and leaving classical music playing for their ficus when they went out. But it was a beautiful collection of myths. Many scientists tried to reproduce the most tantalizing research the book presented to no avail. Cellular and molecular physiologist Clifford Slayman and plant physiologist Arthur Galston, writing in American Scientist in 1979, called it a corpus of fallacious or improvable claims. It didn't help that former CIA agent Baxter, as well as Marcel Vogel, an IBM researcher who claimed to be able to reproduce the Baxter effect, believed that one had to develop an emotional rapport with a plant before any effect was possible. In their view, that explained away any inability of another lab to replicate the results. Empathy between plant and human is the key, Vogel said, and spiritual development is indispensable. Let me just fix my mask. It's fucked. Okay. According to botanists working at the time, the damage that secret life caused to the field cannot be overstated. The twin gatekeepers of science funding boards and peer review boards, always conservative institutions, closed the doors. Over the following years, according to several researchers I spoke with, the National Science Foundation became more reluctant to give grants to anyone studying plants' responses to their environment. Proposals with so much as a whiff of inquiry into plant behavior were turned down. The money, whatever little there had been, dried up. Scientists who had pioneered the field changed course or left sciences altogether. But a select few held on, biding their time with other lines of inquiry, waiting for the tide to turn. In the last decade and a half, it finally has. Funding for some plant behavior research began flowing again, though the grants were still hard to come by at first. Botany journals, though many were still edited by opponents of the plant intelligence field, began letting a trickle of these papers through. The change was likely the result of new technology like genetic sequencing and more advanced microscopes, which made it possible to come to previously outlandish conclusions with real rigor. Small pause. Take a breath. Okay. The change was likely the result of new technology like genetic sequencing and more advanced microscopes, which made it possible to come to previously outlandish conclusions with real rigor. Or perhaps the political mockery that followed the secret life debacle was just far enough in the rearview mirror. Many of the authors didn't use words like intelligence to describe what they found, but the results nonetheless suggested that plants were much more sophisticated than anyone had dared think. Recently, as I came across in my reading, researchers had found promising indicators of memory in plants. Others found that a wide variety of plants are able to distinguish themselves from others and can tell whether or not those others are genetic kin. When such plants find themselves beside their siblings, they rearrange their leaves within 2 days to avoid shading them. Pea shoot roots appear to be able to hear water flowing through sealed pipes and grow toward them, and several plants, including lima beans, and tobacco, can react to an attack of munching insects by summoning those insect-specific predators to come pick them off. Other plants, including a particular tomato's secrete a chemical that causes hungry caterpillars to turn away from devouring their leaves to eat each other instead. Papers probing other remarkable behaviors were growing from a trickle to a fairly robust stream. It seemed like botany was on the verge of something new. I wanted to stick around and watch. Back at my desk in my air-conditioned newsroom, I savored these small tears in the fabric of my day. Something about this renaissance in the study, I don't know. RENAISSANCE in the study of plant behavior spoke to an earlier me. I was an only child for the first 9 years of my life until my brother was born. Even then, a newborn wasn't much use to a 9-year-old girl, especially not one who truly believed she was an adult trapped in a child's body, which is to say I was alone and predisposed to fantasy. Girls of that nature tend to build complex inner worlds that they proceed to drape like a blanket over the world around them. Adults who don't understand this disposition tend to call it melodramatic, but I resented that word, which implied that my version of reality couldn't be trusted. I I was sure I was simply seeing things around me for what they actually were. In most cases, those things were trees and squirrels and sometimes rocks, and they were very much alive, alert to the world. Children are known to be inborn animists. Noticing things that other people named adults seem not to only deepen my sense of separateness. In spring, I watched the hard beaks of purple crocuses crack the cold earth like hatch chips. Ugh. A red-bellied woodpecker drilled the enormous white oak outside my bedroom window. Each time I caught a creature in an act of understated oh god. I'm just gonna skip this one. It's, I'll spell it. Creurelines. It's easy. I know. My brain. I'm anxious. I'm pathogen. I felt I'd stolen a glimpse behind the curtain into their world, the real world. The best part of my childhood home was a mid-sized depression in the land some 100 yards into the woods behind our house. Each spring, some 2 or 3 feet of water swelled there and stayed nearly all year, icing over in December. In summer, I would check my rubber boots for spiders and then amble out ankle-deep, petting the spongy mosses that clung to the tops of the half-submerged rocks and greeting the skunk cabbages as if they were my friends. And they were, in a way. A mated pair of mallard ducks also lived in that swamp, but I didn't talk to them. They seemed to be socially occupied already. They had each other. The plants, on the other hand, seemed to have nothing else to do. It wasn't so much that I imagined these plants to be little humans in another form. I don't remember ever thinking they talked back to me, but I also felt they weren't mute exactly. They had their own thing going on, like me. They were like children, underestimated. And the ecology of imagination in childhood, the writer and researcher Edith Cobb spends 2 decades investigating the role of nature in the early thinking of children. She finds that children have an open system attitude that allows them a certain emotional proximity to the natural world. For the young child, the eternal questioning of the nature of the real is largely a wordless dialect between self and world, she writes. She references many artists and thinkers who describe the creative methodology to be essentially a channeling of the perspective they had as children. Bernard Berenson, a 20th century giant of art criticism, writes in his autobiography that his happiest moment, perhaps, was as a young boy standing on a tree stump. It was a morning early in summer. A silver haze simmered and trembled over the lime trees. The air was laden with their fragrance. The temperature was like a caress. I remember, I need not recall, that I climbed up a tree stump and felt suddenly immersed in itness. I did not call it by that name. I had no need for words. It and I were one. Who doesn't have a memory like that? The itness here bears so much resemblance to the sense of the real echoed by Sachs, Dillard, and von Humboldt, and to what I felt as a child, crouched and watching the crocuses. I wonder what moments like this are, and what they can do, what space they open up for thought. Decades after leaving that house in the woods, I was a city dweller, hermetically sealed into an office building. My 9-year-old sense of knowingness of a world beyond the people feeder was dulled to a slick nub. But then the fern obsession came over me, and then the plant intelligence debate. Something familiar began to tick quietly inside me again. Lunchtime botany reading became my reason for the day. What I found in the scientific journals was some of the most acebic, oh god, A-C-E-B, no, A-C-E-R-B-I-Z, controversy I'd come across in my years as a reporter. Just as common as the papers exploring plant intelligence were the responses denouncing the burgeoning field, most often for word choice. Intelligence applied to plants did not sit well with plenty of plant scientists. Consciousness, a yet bolder conjecture, even less so. They made good points. Plants don't have brains, much less neurons, and plants evolved to meet challenges so different from our own. What need would they have for either of those things? A paper in Trends in Plant Science titled "Plants Neither Possess Nor Require Consciousness," co-authored by 8 highly credentialed plant scientists, appeared to tip off a series of heated back and forths. The authors wrote that it was extremely unlikely that plants lacking any anatomical structures remotely comparable to the complexity of the threshold brain possess consciousness. Rather, they said, anything a plant did could be chalked up to innate programming via genetic information that has been acquired through natural selection and which is fundamentally different from cognition or knowing, at least as these terms are widely understood. The authors conceded that excellent papers have been published by plant consciousness proponents that make no truly contentious claims, even the ones about the role of electrical signaling in plant bodies, which they concede can be analogous, but they are careful to say not homologous. Oh goodness. HOMOLOGOUS to animal nervous systems. The controversy, they wrote, stemmed from researchers who took their conclusions too far, who risibly oversimplified the meaning of terms like learning or feeling in service of the plausibility of their claims. Why is anthropomorphism resurgent in biology today? They lamented. Science is a conservative institution for a reason. Conservatism is a crucial backstop against false knowledge, but something in this paper felt self-defeating. Science indeed has no agreed-upon definition for life, death, intelligence, nor consciousness. Words certainly matter, but the definitions of these words are not settled and are therefore expansive. Could plants not hold intelligences that look quite different from our own? And the truth was, whatever electrical signaling pseudo-nervous system they were talking about sounded extremely compelling. Science, for all its strengths, is constrained to the sort of questions that can be answered using the scientific method. The meaning or definition of life is arguably not one of them. Left to the sciences, which were never built to take up ethical questions of being and non-being, plants remain conceptually locked out in the inanimate cold. Yet here were all these scientists violently trying to engage with the hardest question of all, the very nature of being alert to the world, the hard problem of consciousness. And they were, after all, the stewards of the scientific information that might be used to come to any ethical conclusion about where plants fit and how they might relate to them. Permitting or not permitting certain experiments to proceed and be published was entirely in their hands. I wanted to listen closer. It was clear that the anti-plant intelligence camp wished to be explicit that plants are not like animals. but they were using a human-centric definition of intelligence and consciousness to claim that plants couldn't possibly possess either thing. That argument seemed to me like it was marred with an internal contradiction. It doubled back on itself. Paco Calvo, philosopher of cognitive science at the University of Murcia, and Anthony Tuaves, a well-known veteran of plant physiology at the University of Edinburgh, agreed. This is surely circular reasoning. Beyond that, I wondered if there was fear. I could see why those arguing against the idea of plant intelligence didn't want the narrative to slip away from them and enter mainstream culture prematurely, where it might be washed out of complexity and absorbed in some diluted, fanciful form. Perhaps it would be used to support the same New Age notions that got them into so much trouble last time with the secret life of plants. This I understood up to a point. There has always been an extreme tendency in popular culture to layer simple human narratives on other species, as seen in virtually every fairy tale or animated film. Still, it felt like a clear underestimation of that same capacity. The public's imagination was expansive, I thought. It could very well expand to include non-human types of intelligence, if given the chance. Yes, it was a tall order. Making the mental space to imagine truly different intelligences without jumping to easy human conclusions is a difficult task. Most of us haven't been asked to do that before, but grappling with complexity is a mind-expanding exercise. To hold back the larger scientific inquiry based on a fear about how it would be received seemed unfair to the rest of us. The world we could have if complexity was not backgrounded was the world I wanted to live in. It seemed I had come to the plant intelligence debate early in its formation, but at just the right time. There were so many threads still to be picked up, yet there was real science behind it, and the results coming in were too alluring to leave aside. What was at stake? Over and over, I saw the debate framed as a dispute over syntax, but it looked to me more of a dispute over worldview, over the nature of reality, over what plants were, particularly in contrast to ourselves. Okay, almost done, I think. Just a couple of pages. Yeah, just a couple. Okay. They say trying to understand any culture is like looking at an iceberg. There are vast depths you cannot see. I saw the world of botanists and their culture, ideas they worked with and built on as more like a rhizomatic plant. From where I sat, printing out and rifling through papers, I could see the shoots, the names, the concepts. But before long, one botanist implored me to speak with another who would, in turn, direct me to another. Networks of knowledge began to emerge, the many unseen underground connections between labs and journals. Who trusted who and who didn't. Shoots and runners. Each time I called a scientist, I was reminded that most of them were utterly uninterested in yoking plants into human service. My best calls were with researchers totally in love with their subjects, the kind of love that you want to tell everyone about. Once convinced that I truly wished to know, They allowed themselves to unleash their volcanic enthusiasm. They told me about the corner of the world they themselves had just demystified, their own personal shard of the vast and chaotic puzzle of biology they had found by sifting the finest sieve through the sediment of the world, turning it over in their hands, and through some mix of laborious years of reading and lab work and obsessive interest, had known what meaning it held, where to set it in its place. To see nature that way, I knew, was only a partial view. Nature is not a puzzle waiting to be put together, or a codex waiting to be deciphered. Nature is chaos in motion. Biological life is a spiraling diffusion of possibilities, fractal in its profusion. Every organism, and certainly every plant, has ricocheted out of another fragment of the evolutionary web of I just combined green leafy things to variate further. These each are, of course, still morphing, because that sort of thing never ends, except in extinction. The multiplicity felt endless and impossible to grasp. The scientists I spoke with knew this, and were trying anyways. It made me love them more. I began to learn what to say, or accurately, not to say, to keep a scientist on the phone. Plant sensing was generally fine, neutral territory. Plant behavior crept into more risky territory, and plant intelligence could be outright dangerous. Consciousness, I learned, I must only bring up once I made it through the crucible of each of these prior descriptors without feeling I might be hung up on or scolded. When I hit on a trigger word, I sensed it immediately. The researcher became cautious, less open, especially if we were still in the dance of sussing each other out, when I knew they were still deciding if they should be talking to me at all. But every so often I'd feel the soft spot, where there was give, where they clearly had their own curiosities about what behavior could mean and what might count as intelligence. They would thoughtfully consider my questions and, after some hesitation, give thoughtful answers. After this revealed inner conflicts. Too many people I spoke to, intelligence felt dangerous, but only because most people made a mental leap directly to human intelligence. Measuring plants against human cognition made no sense. It just rendered plants a lesser human, lesser animals. Anthropomorphizing was dangerous because it diminished these green bodies, leaving no room for the recognition that plants deploy several senses, or could one say intelligences, that far exceed anything humans can do in a similar category. Our versions of those senses, if we even have them, are paltry in comparison. It was hard for these researchers to talk about plant intelligence. They worried that it was a trap, leading to conclusions that did not represent the real wonder of what they'd learned. By now, it had been more than a year since I had first fallen into these questions. It was August 2019 in New York City, and the air was thick with the tang of heated garbage and pavement. Every day, I exited my sweltering Flatbush apartment and walked the 6 blocks to Prospect Park. I sometimes stopped to buy a cold water coconut, a seed, or a few inches of sugar cane, a grass, from a man who sold them off a card table at the corner. When I stepped past the park's stone columns, I slowed down. The light darkened, and the temperature dropped, thanks to the exhale of millions of plants at once. I remembered that prior to the discovery of photosynthesis as a reaction to produce sugar, naturalists believed that its purpose was to serve as nature's air conditioner. The cool air settled on my skin, and I inhaled fully. It smelled like wet leaves, clean and a head clearing. I now regarded the broadleaf plantain and chokeberry with a mix of awe and suspicion. I was newly aware that there was more going on in the lives of each plant I passed, both above ground and below, than I'd ever imagined, that they might well know I was walking by. Amid the wash of greens, bright and dingy, I began to see many distinct species and exponentially more individuals. I knew there was high drama everywhere I looked, though I couldn't see it nor fully know the nature of it. I was regaining material intimacy with the natural world by looking at plants. It wasn't a way to ignore environmental catastrophe. It was a way to reattach myself to the stakes. Each plant was an embodied world we stood to lose, every ecosystem another galaxy. Still, reading plant intelligence papers felt like trying to understand a mountain by looking only through a hand lens. The flurry of recent discoveries merely underlined that. Researchers had just found that plants could remember, but not where those memories were stored. They found kin recognition, but not how those kin were recognized. These discoveries were more like hints, fragments that pointed towards something larger, something whole. What was a plant? No one yet seemed to know. I decided on that walk to quit my job to think about plants full-time. The newsroom where I worked had fallen on hard times. People were laid off as ad revenue dipped and investors got spooked. Morale sank through the floor. I could no longer see the point in my being there. I felt I could be dismissed at any time, so that even the security of full-time employment began to seem like a lie. I had some savings. I would downsize my life. It was time for a change. A childhood friend had a room for me in the old farmhouse on the farm where he'd grown up, where we had run through the rye fields as kids. I could situate myself there and then travel to see plants in more places, in their ancestral habitats, the places they'd evolved in. It would be worth it. Something clearly important was happening in botany. Science was approaching a precipice from which it couldn't possibly return. Our belief that plants are unfeeling beings seemed to be wholly wrong. The moment felt ripe. It was a good story, too good to stay locked in the obscure realms of academia. I began to feel like it could change the world. Certainly it was already changing mine. The stakes of the story began to feel much bigger than my own. I messed that one up. I'll redo it again. The stakes of the story began to feel much bigger than my own personal attraction to it. Or perhaps I thought they were one and the same. The more time I spent thinking about plants, the more I wanted to spend time thinking about plants. It felt abundantly good for me. I felt like I could see everything more clearly. I walked back home and looked up at the gigantic golden pothos hanging in my kitchen window. All of its leaves were upright. They had all swiveled to face the window pane since I'd been gone, practically plastering themselves to it. I glanced around at my other houseplants. The philodendron was now poking a slender brown aerial root into the potted jade beside it. I stutter and get my words jumbled sometimes. That is what happens there. I will continue. Aerial roots into the potted jade beside it. I looked at my rubber plant, which was a cutting from my father's rubber plant, which was itself a cutting from his parents' rubber plant, which had been a gift on their wedding day 60 years before. That original plant, now a formidable tree, still sat by the grand piano in the living room, lording over the scene. It once nearly died. My grandmother's mother lopped off its surviving branch, soaked its blunt end in water until white roots slithered out and coaxed it complete and coaxed its complete regrowth from that single healthy limb. 4 generations of my family had handled this plant, and here it still was, silently building new body parts. Wasn't this a kind of memory in itself? It had become unbearable not to understand. I had to go out and see for myself. Okay, that took forever. I'm a slow reader. Okay, well, I might continue this. Chapter 2 is how science changes its mind. Apologies for the stutter. And not knowing how to pronounce some words. Because I don't talk frequently. Yeah.